Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Welcome back, webinar number 5 in our webinar series, and this is the last one of the initial work. There'll be a few more that I will add in as we get closer to the day, just as a review and check in. But for this time, we're going to just go back to a little bit what we talked about in our last webinar on the overview of cognitive rigor and how we apply that into unwrapping standards. And while some of us maybe have gone through that before, I'm just going to ask that everybody kind of goes through this webinar looking at it with the same lens, or what maybe catches your attention differently. And I'm just going to ask that everybody completes one unwrapping example of a standard they're going to work on prior to our time together, February 1st or 2nd. It allows me to go in and check, give any feedback, and see if there's any kind of issues ahead of time. So that, again, that's going to keep the momentum moving when we come back together and work. So as always, several of you, as I've said on the last webinar, I'm starting to get some questions and thoughts. Really appreciate that opportunity to give some feedback back and forth and have everybody feel they're coming into the days with as much understanding as possible. Always start and end with our success criteria, and you'll be able to state why unwrapping is a critical step in any quality assessment design process. To deconstruct or unwrap a standard by identifying the concepts and skills which will provide learning targets for students, and then be able to determine accurate rigor levels that students must demonstrate for the standard you're teaching. And that's why that DOK is so important, and it creates that understanding that we can't just be working on standards and not knowing if students aren't meeting them, how far away they are, or if they meet them at a lower level of rigor, then we've got different information going to our students that allows gaps in their learning when they go on to the next grade level or next course. You'll definitely need your handout for this particular webinar, and I'm going to go back to the points I make every time. Every assessment comes down to these 3 points. What's my purpose? And then when do I have enough evidence to make an inference? Well, we got to start with our purpose, and uncovering or unwrapping will help us find those critical elements and determine our purpose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through several standards. I'm going to unwrap them right with you, following along, and then give you a chance to know how you're going to unwrap your example and where to find that. So first thing we'll do is we'll identify our nouns, our noun phrases, and our verbs. So what we have here is we really have one verb, one skill, describe. Then we have nouns and noun phrases. We have characters, story, major events, challenges. I particularly highlighted this one because the word respond actually is sort of an embedded concept, because what students will have to do is know what a response is. So what we do the first is, what are all the nouns or noun phrases? Just what are what's the content knowledge that they're going to have to know? Then we go back to our skills, and this is where for some it might be a different way to look at it. For this particular standard, and again, we just put our nouns there first. What are the nouns or noun phrases? And again, major is an important adjective. It's not just events, it was a major event or a major challenge. And when we see a word like respond, yeah, technically then they got to know what a response is, which is why I put some asterisks there. So we can't just go nouns and verbs with sort of the just laser-like focus just to get it done real quick. We got to dig in a little bit. But then for the skills, they have to describe how characters respond to major events, and they have to describe how characters respond to major challenges. What I've done now is I've created an outline or a roadmap of all the things I need to make sure I include in my instruction, but then also my assessment. But now we're going to go to, and for some of you this is review, or some of this might be new, we're going to go to our cognitive rigor matrix that you see in your handout. And we're still using Bloom's taxonomy as a guide. So when we look at possibly what our verbs are, this kind of gives us looking across. But then what we have to do is we have to go, okay, within these, what are we kind of seeing in terms of the depth of knowledge? And as I mentioned before, more than one right answer, things of that nature. But these will be guides to kind of determine, okay, that concept and skill for describing how they respond to major events really comes in at a 2, and how they respond to major challenges really comes in closer to a 3. So that helps me know that's how I have to design my assessment. And we mentioned before, if it's a depth of knowledge tree, there's probably going to be more than one right answer. So I know now I'm going to need possibly a constructed response around that. Here's a reading from informational text. And again, identifying the nouns and the verbs. And as I started doing this as a young teacher, it was about underlining the nouns and circling the concepts. When I first started presenting this, I actually used to do it with an overhead projector. And for some of us, that might be a tool we still have. I don't know. I haven't seen one in a while. For some young teachers, you might not remember one of those unless it was used in the classroom because we don't use those anymore. So it's really not about how you underline or circle. That's just how I would guide everyone to do it. First, then, I want to again list my nouns, my noun phrases. Then I want to put my skills aligned to a noun or noun phrase. They have to identify the main purpose of a text. Then they have to identify what the author wants to explain. They have to identify what the author wants to answer. They have to identify what the author wants to describe. Back to our cognitive rigor matrix, and these all end up coming at a 2. And so the reason for doing it this way, and you see that in your handout, you see the same example. Now I know when I'm designing my assessment, it doesn't mean that I can't have an item that students wouldn't be able to show me if they could identify what the author wanted to explain, describe, and answer together. We don't have to assess them separately. I just need to be able to know if they can't do one of those, if they can't do 2 of those. I got to make sure my items tell me what they're able to do, and if they're not, what their gap might be. Do a writing one now. Again, nouns and noun phrases. Now our skills. For this one, they have to write informative text to explain the topic, convey ideas clearly, convey information clearly. And I put the word convey in italics because if we go back to the standard, students have to write, to examine, and convey. Convey really falls under here. The only time you can convey it to me is when you're writing. See that? So the main skill is write, but as they're writing, they're examining. As they're writing, they're conveying. So this might be a different level of unwrapping, kind of what I would like to call unwrapping 2.0, because now I know I got to make sure as they're doing that, I'm going to put these checkpoints in. And when we talk later about scoring guides, my scoring guides should line up right with this. Does it help me know if they can convey the ideas clearly and convey information clearly? Or maybe they can do all 3 with the explanatory text, but they can't necessarily do it with informative texts. Back to our cognitive rigor matrix, these both come out to be a 3. Here's a math standard. And in and of itself, for those of us that aren't math teachers, it probably scares us a little bit. But there's a lot of skills and concepts embedded here. So first, I circle and identify all the skills. Then I go back and identify and underline all of my nouns or noun phrases or content. There's a lot of content here. List them all there. And for any grade level, certainly some students, this won't be the first time they've come in contact with that terminology. Go to our skills, though. They actually had to read multi-digit whole numbers, number names, in expanded form, and write multi-digit whole names. They had to do both. Then they had to compare 2-digit numbers, use the symbols, record the comparisons. Now I've got a roadmap to say, as I'm designing, or maybe looking even at my pacing or my instructional design, what do I want to check for early? And we'll talk about how we think about our pre-assessments. So that we might say, if they can't, we're going to check first if they can use the symbols. We're going to check first if they could use the base 10 numbers, whatever that is. We might determine what really needs to come first. But now I know on my post-assessment, my end of unit, my end of short cycle, I got to have all of that in there. Here's science example. And again, you can follow right along on your handout. Going a little bit faster now with the underlining and circling. Here's all of our concepts. And footnote, we see here the word attractive. Well, then they got to know what an attraction is. Sometimes a standard might say they need to summarize, which is the skill. Well, that means the concept also gets added in as summary, or vice versa. We've got our skills. And this is where some standards, as they're written, they have to construct an argument to support the claim, present the argument, use the argument, ... The gravitational interactions are attractive and depend on masses of interacting objects. It might seem that we're just rewriting the standard. Not at all. But now I know students have to construct an argument. They have to present it. They have to use it. It's all around the gravitational interactions. And I think we know some students could use or present an argument if we gave it to them, but they're struggling with the construction part. Or they construct it, but then they're not able to support it well. Or the evidence that they're using really doesn't support it. Now I can look as I'm designing my assessment items and my intermittent instruction to check for those pieces. There's a high school version. Determine the central idea or information of a primary or secondary source. Provide an accurate summary how key events or ideas develop over the course of the text. A lot of information in this one. Concepts, and again, nouns or noun phrases. It's not an idea, it's the central idea. It's the accurate summary. Now we have our skills. Determine the central idea from a primary source. Determine the central idea from a secondary source. Provide an accurate summary. Now this is where, as I mentioned from the last standard, if they have to provide an accurate summary, well then wouldn't it make sense by default they're going to have to summarize key events over the text, key ideas over the text. We add our DOK. So now what I'm going to guide you through is your ability to practice unwrapping a standard, because I would really like if everybody comes in, if folks come in with their standards unwrapped, there's so much a better chance to get to so much more quality work time. But if the standards aren't unwrapped properly and they're not at the accurate rigor levels, then everything in our assessment doesn't have that foundational purpose. Purpose, evidence, inference. My purpose is the unwrapping of my priority standards for my unit, and then I got to make sure as I'm designing my assessment, I'm gathering enough evidence to make a quality inference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to guide you in a moment how to get into the Google folder that I've created for everyone to be able to do this. So I'm going to move us into, you should see, I'm going to go back, here we go. You should by now have gotten a link and an email that takes you to this folder. What you'll do then, based on your level, if you're elementary, middle, or high school, you're going to elementary, and I will have all of your names before you get to this webinar of who's coming, and I will make your particular folder. So if your name was Abe Leakin, you would just click here, you'll have your document. And so all I'm going to ask you to do now is take one standard, completely write it out, and then unwrap it with your nouns, your verbs, and your DOK. Again, you might not need every cell, but it will give me a chance to go in and give feedback, and if there's anything that has been off base or missed, and an understanding that I want to own for everybody, I can help ahead of time. And so all I'm going to ask, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint slides now, is that by January 27th, you practice unwrapping that standard, and it's in there. The sooner the better. So you're going to need to think, what am I going to be teaching between February 15th-ish and spring break? Here's my couple of standards, and here's the one I'm going to unwrap. If you want to do more than one, by all means, feel free to. But I would like everyone to have done that by the Friday before. The earlier you do it, the better. If everybody does it on the Friday before, it's just going to be a little bit more work for me right up front. So if you can do it early, then I can jump in. But that, if everybody comes in, that's a piece that I've seen as I do this work. If folks don't get it or they get behind, we need more time to get there, or they go back later and they go, gosh, my assessment items aren't lined up because my unwrapping wasn't right. So it's really, really important that we do this as much as possible before, because as I said all along, the intent of these webinars was to help you be as productive those days as possible. And finally, the acid test is when two or more teachers, educators come up with the same level of context, rigor, agreement of skills when unwrapping the same standard. So if you're going to be working at all in a pair, I'm going to ask everybody to do it individually first. So I unwrap mine, Bryce unwraps his, same standard, then we look, are we accurate? Are we on the same page? Are we close enough to be able to say, yeah, we're looking at that standard the same way, or I go, man, I don't know if I saw it that way. That's what's critical. So success criteria, once again, hopefully you can state why unwrapping and see how it's such a critical point in designing our assessments to deconstruct that standard by identifying the concepts and skills for a specific unit, and then determining the accurate rigor levels. And again, if you're having any struggles at all, please feel free to email me. You see the directions, not only the guidance that you see in the handout, but also to get to the Google folder or anything at all. And if something happens and you can't get there and you unwrap and you email it to me, even better. But the more it can be in that folder, it's easy for me because you'll see my comments and my feedback right there. So thanks as always. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'm really excited to see everybody February 1st and 2nd.